Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hi, everyone. We're so excited to be here with you today. My name is Amal Hussein, and I'm with my co-host, Danny Blue. Say hi.
Hey, everybody.
Hi. And we are part of the Web Platform Podcast, and we're super excited today to be talking to y'all about all things JavaScript with Mr. JavaScript himself, Jordan Harband. We'll get to Jordan in a bit, but what we're going to be talking about today is really how the language has changed in the past 5 years. JavaScript is all grown up. Gone are the days of just, inlining your JavaScript in a script tag. And so we're going to be exploring all of the ways that the language has evolved and just really how that's shifted our the culture around how we build modern web applications. And so we have a lot to talk about in 40 minutes. So it's a tall order, Jordan, no pressure. But with that said, let's get started. So welcome, Jordan. Hello, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, thank you. Let's see. I've been on TC39, the committee that writes the specification for JavaScript, since 2014. It's been a while. I've been an editor for 2.5 years or so. I maintain a lot of open source libraries, probably too many. I've been doing JavaScript a very long time.
Yeah, and you're really involved with TC39, is that right?
Yeah, I spend, we have 6 meetings a year that are about, 20 plus hours each time. And there's a bunch of in-between meeting work on it. And I've had a bunch of proposals advance. As an editor, I have to review everyone else's proposals. It's definitely a lot of work, but luckily I enjoy it.
Yeah, and so for those of you who aren't familiar, TC39 is the committee that's in charge of steering the technical direction for the ECMAScript language specification, which is basically the JavaScript standard. And Jordan has been one of the editors of the standard since 2018. So we're really excited to have him here today. And so I'm going to start with my first question, Jordan, which is, a lot of the new language features since 2015, I feel like they fit into a gamut of things. We have syntactic sugar, for things like classes. We have, language extensions to, arrays and strings and all these other cool things. And we have a bunch of things that look like it's, for JavaScript on the server. And so can you just talk a little bit about how that kind of has come to be? Do you think that Node has really pushed the envelope with JavaScript, the language? And
yeah, so things changed a lot after ES 2015, ES6, right? The process for getting changes into the language before that was essentially a bunch of smart people in the room who had overlapping and also conflicting priorities, would just kind of talk about their ideas, and there's a lot of debate and arguing and bike shedding. And it took many, many years to get a standard together. The previous version before ES 2015 was from 2011, which was ES 5.1. So that's 4 years between producing any specification. But the process that group came up with before I joined, which would take effect after ES 2015, has a bunch of concrete stages, which include specific entrance criteria and explanations of what's expected during each stage. And part of that is that there has to be shipping implementations before it lands in the standard, which was not the case beforehand. So there are things that from ES 2015 that virtually no browser has shipped, for example, and that is partially because in the old stage process, that wasn't a requirement. So I think that what that means is that in the current process, the things that land in the language have been vetted to a much larger degree and with a lot more people and a lot more constituencies, and that includes Node. Node has always been considered in the committee, but has not really ever had any official representation or even any, direct representation from people that have a voice in Node until a number of years ago. And I think the post ES 2015 process has helped a lot with that.
So Amal mentioned, okay, one, I did not realize, so I've known about the stages and things like that. I did not realize that those were that new for
Yeah.
getting things into the language. That's because we've talked about like specs and that kind of stuff on this show quite a bit. And I guess just at the point I started paying attention to that sort of thing, they were always there. So that I actually find that very, very interesting. One question I have about, I guess, like the specs and, you know, like needing implementations and stuff like that. Amal mentioned that there are two different sorts of things, right? There are some things that seem to be largely syntactic sugar, and that might not be 100% accurate, but with things like classes, and then there are other completely new things that aren't, you know, like really weren't possible before. Is the proposal process different for those sorts of things? Like, does one does one slide through, not slide through, but does one get through a good bit easier than the other? So like, is like a major language extension or something like that more difficult to get through standards than something that is more or less sugar?
So there are definitely some things that slide through more easily, right? The one that was a real quick one was optional catch bindings, because all of us in the room had that problem where we had this exception variable that we didn't need, and it was gross and ugly, and you know, we just kind of ignored it. And removing a binding is like it was just, it was kind of a no-brainer. Like it wasn't controversial. That went through really quickly. There were some API methods like object.values and object.entries that were able to get in pretty quickly because object.keys was already there. They're a complement. There was already a precedent of that triplet of methods from other things. It just kind of moved through pretty quickly. So, but the difficulty for adding new language capabilities is making sure it's possible to implement it in a performant way, right? And the browsers all have representatives in the room, as does Node, and so we have to make sure that that's the case. There's also kind of security and encapsulation level concerns, you know, kind of OCAP stuff and other things that, you know, where folks are trying to run untrusted JavaScript code and they want to be able to maintain the security of that. Like Salesforce has a whole platform where anyone can put JavaScript into it and run it on people's web pages. So, but with syntactic sugar, people are still bike shedding about what it looks like. So it's, I wouldn't go as far as saying that sugar is easy, just that it's a different kind of debate than low-level primitive features.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, Jordan. So I think promise all settled is another one that I can think of. As I remember just learning about that a year ago as a proposal, and it's already in language now. I mean, it's just, I think that went super fast, and I think it's
true.
It feels like you're right. Like some language features are just like common sense. You know, Brandon Ike forgot to do this, or, you know, like just like duh. And there isn't much deliberation about that. But I think I want to kind of get back to a point that you brought up earlier around just performance and implementation, and, you know, what the consequences of that are. Like the committee is made up of implementers, right? So implementers being the folks that are writing the compilers that JavaScript runs on. So folks from the V8 team, SpiderMonkey, Chakra core, JavaScript core. So there's implementers, and then there's you know, just like language nerds, you know, sorry to not find a better word, you know, the representatives from other, you know, lots of companies. And then you have kind of practitioners, right? So you have like web developers, you know, these expert seasoned folks. And so there's this interesting kind of like trifecta and like this little tension and push-pull between these three groups. Can you kind of speak to that a little bit before we move on from this?
So actually, I think that the tensions you're describing is, it's sort of a game theory, right? The browsers the browsers don't have to follow the standard, right? I mean, there's no like use of force to make them do it. They're choosing to do it. They're choosing to do it because they think that it makes the web better for everyone, and they think that it'll make their users happier. And it also, I think, frees them up to compete on you know, other things than what's JavaScript, right? They can compete on performance. They can compete on synchronization features and things like that. But because they are choosing to comply with the specification, that also means that folks that aren't browsers can't sail into the committee and be like, screw you browsers, this is what we want in the language. So it's kind of a delicate dance where the browsers don't want to, for many reasons, they don't want to kind of ignore opinions that aren't their own, but neither can anyone ignore browser opinions. And so everyone has to sort of convince everyone in the room, browsers and community folks alike, and there's often overlap between those, that the feature being proposed is good for JavaScript, but also good for the web, because JavaScript is larger than the web, but the web is very, very large. So it's tough to find a sort of coexistence sometimes between those things, and that's a lot of the work that we have to do.
Very cool. Yeah, that is interesting. Sometimes I feel like I'm realizing a lot of things in this discussion already that I didn't really think about. Like the fact that you just said is like the browsers don't have to do what we say to do. And that makes sense. But I never thought about that before. But it's absolutely true. That's very, very interesting.
I'm pretty sure tail call optimization is still only valid in Safari or implemented in Safari. I think it's implemented in Chrome behind a flag, if I remember correctly.
I think Chrome has long since removed the implementation.
Have they?
Yeah. I believe Safari is the only browser that ships proper tail calls right now.
Yeah, which means technically, people, get ready for your minds to be blown. I think Safari is the only fully ECMAScript 15 compliant browser. Am I right, Jordan?
I believe that is correct.
Take that, Safari. Safari for the win. Actually, another really interesting thing about Safari, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this, Jordan. I think folks from the JavaScript core team, if I remember correctly, when they're implementing new features, they have really strict performance standards. And so, they can't implement something and have the engine be affected negatively at all. And so they're really performance fanatics. And that's really not the case in V8. I think it's a little bit more of the wild, wild west there. But is that true? Well, maybe not the wild, wild west piece, but the
I mean,
performance
the sense I've gotten from speaking to the implementers of JSC and V8 and so on is that they all have different tolerances for impacting performance, but there are a lot of kind of scenarios or code paths where none of them will brook any slowdown of any kind. I mean, one of the big reasons that decorators didn't advance in its latest form was because a number of browser engines were concerned that they wouldn't be able to implement it in a way that would avoid slowing down non-decorated classes, right? Like they might have been willing to accept decorated classes being slow, but not regular classes like getting slower. So I think that they're all pretty performance sensitive. I mean, this is, like I was saying before, it's a bit of a game theory, right? The browsers are all sort of competing with each other. They all want people to use them. And that means that they have to work the best on all the web pages somebody likes. And the best is never going to mean slower.
For sure. Yeah, I know I've said it a couple of times, but I'm finding this entire conversation extremely fascinating for reasons that I thought it would be, but not for reasons that I'm coming to realize. So talking more about the language itself. So the language seems to be used maybe differently by, say, library authors and by end users. And there are certain features that seem like they might not be used very often by me, for example, just a lowly web developer trying to build a website, not used often by me, but might be used by some of the big framework, like some of the big frameworks or something like that. Do you have any thoughts on kind of the way that those two I guess not two ecosystems, but the way that those two groups kind of interact with the language and why it's different?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think even it's hard to predict in advance, right? Like fetch on the web, that was designed to be a low-level primitive only for library authors, but that is not how it's used. Everyone loves to use it directly, but it was never intended for that. And so, like there's a lot of features like symbols, for example. Their primary value is in avoiding name collisions, and that is particularly important for protocols like promises have .then, which means if you name a thing with a .then method, you've just accidentally made a thing that's like a promise, right? But if you have a symbol for things like symbol.iterator for the iterable protocol, you can't accidentally make an iterable, right? You have to be doing it on purpose. And so protocols work really well with symbols because they have to be intentional. But protocols are often defined on a reusable piece of code, and often those are libraries. They may be inside an app, right? Like, there's plenty of companies that have internal like reusable things, but the number of developers in that company even that defines that code is very small, whereas the number that consumes it would be very large. So I think that there's, just like there's tension between web folks and non-web folks, there's tension between library use cases and end user use cases, where it's important to make, we all want to make them both better, but it's important to try to find a balance where you're not sacrificing the utility for one group in order to serve the other group. And there's something the web has called the priority of constituencies that I think is really important, that is brought up a lot in TC39, but isn't one of our like official principles or anything. And I don't have it pulled up in front of me, but it's something like users above authors, above implementers, above spec writers. And it's basically saying like, never make the spec easier to write at the cost of like making it harder to implement. Never make the implementation better at the cost of making it worse for people who write the code. Never make writing the code easier at the cost of making it worse for people who use the web, right? Like I think that's my understanding of it anyway. And I think thinking about trade-offs in that context is really useful, because it makes it clear when you're optimizing for the wrong thing. A thing I say often is like, don't optimize for writing code, optimize for reading and understanding it, because you write it once and you read it and maintain it a million times, right? But it's really easy to make writing your code quicker, and it makes it harder to understand later, so it's the same sort of challenge with language features.
Wow, that was very deep. A very philosophical moment right now. I feel like that mantra needs to be put on a T-shirt. It should be like the TC39 slogan. You all should make an acronym. And I feel like that mantra is so powerful, because I think I have personally actually always practiced that rule, in the sense that, I write code for other people to read, and it's also for machines to process, but people first, right? So I'm not going to write the one-line fancy shortcuts if it makes it more difficult for me or others in the future to read and understand, right? So
cleverness is an anti-pattern.
Yeah, exactly. Don't be clever, be verbose if you need to, because code is really a communication first, right? So I think that's super powerful. But
I've had this conversation with a couple people just in the past week, where I've said, like, if you do something and you think it's clever, you probably shouldn't do it.
Yeah, because you're going to forget it, and then you're going to shoot yourself in the foot first. Usually you're the first person.
Well, there's that other quote. It's if the code was as like, where was it? Something like, if it took all of your smarts to write it, then you are by definition not qualified to debug it.
Yeah, no, that's powerful. But kind of getting to the Danny's earlier point around language. I mean, things like symbols for me, there's just a lot of things I think that are either misunderstood or underutilized, and perhaps that's okay, because maybe that wasn't the intention, but for mass consumption. But it feels like there are elements of the language which are certainly they feel very much oriented towards people that are creating libraries, right? So, proxies is another good example of that. And so, not that I think there's analytics on this per se, but, I mean, does it make sense that there's, 80% of the people most people are using like 20% of the language or whatever versus, I'm just curious, like if you have thoughts on that.
I mean, I think that it's okay if there's features in the language that most people don't use, right? Like proxy is super a niche one, and you can do some really clever and hacky things with it. But like its primary purpose, as I understand it, was adding some new, previously impossible features to be used in concert with a concept called membranes that you have to build yourself, and is really hard to build correctly. So like if anyone's interested, go look up a library that does it already. But it's you can't really use proxy by itself for more than basic things unless you understand all those concepts, which are beyond me. So like, I think it's fine because it's adding a new capability, right? Like shared array buffers. That's, that's not a thing that most people are going to run into, but if it wasn't there, or if it's, then there's a lot of cross-threading speedups that libraries won't be able to do in the future, right? Like if shared array buffers are around for long enough, then things like React or whatever will be able to speed up, rendering and stuff like that. I don't know. So I think it's okay to do that, because like the other thing on the web is we're working on a long time scale, right? Like features that ship now, websites, unless they're fully transpilable, websites can't really ship them for many years. There's still plenty of websites that have users on IE9.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, I think we could talk for hours about like the bubble with modern web dev, and like, I think someone put up a photo recently where it's like, here's the reality of the web. Most of it's still on jQuery. Here's the reality of the jobs. Most of them want React developers, So speaking of React developers, I think you touched on a very controversial topic, which is like this React rendering speed. So I'm just going to like backtrack out of there and just X out real quick. but it's a really good segue into what Danny and I wanted to talk about, which is tooling, right? So we have all this, like we have kind of made JavaScript impossible for newbies, modern JavaScript, or the thing that we call modern JavaScript, right? So it's like tooling, it's not even optional, tooling required for the most part. And there's certainly a movement, and one that I wholeheartedly support and I'm excited about, of people trying to kind of say, I want to try to build things without bundlers, without transpilers. Like that's great, right? But ultimately, that's just not the reality that you see as mainstream adoption. And so, like, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, it's kind of scary and also awesome at the same time, but also I think terribly terrifying for me.
I mean, I grew up on view source, right? Like that's part of the way I learned how to work on the web. And I see a lot of folks who also did that and are saying like, are kind of, old man shaking fist at cloud about it and kind of like, well, things were better when I was young and like, let's bring it back to that. I liked that, and that was approachable, and that was great for newcomers. But at the same time, it made it really, like, it was really hard back in the day to ship a website that worked on every web browser. I mean, I had a startup 10 years ago where I wrote CSS hacks to target Firefox 2, 3.0, 3.1, 3.5. Like, that's insane. That's not even the right term. That is just an inordinate amount of work in order to make sure that a web page does not exclude users. And I really think accessibility is the thing that people should focus on here, and not tooling complexity. When you're making a website, who are you excluding? Because it's always going to be somebody, right? And it's fine if the answer is people without computers, right? Like maybe you can't do anything about that, but like, you're never excluding nobody. So you have to decide who you're comfortable excluding. And there's a lot of people who have slow internet, older machines, cheap phones, that just can't afford or don't know how to upgrade things, their browser or their machine. And if you are handwriting all of your code and not using any tooling, you are excluding a very large number of human beings off the internet. It might be 2% of your analytics, but that's like millions of people potentially, right? And so whenever these conversations happen in one of my jobs, I try and change the discussion from talking about percentages to talking about number of humans, because 0.1% of the internet is like a very, very large number of people, and these people all are important, and they're all individuals, they all matter. So like, the thing that I think we really get about tooling, and that's often missed in these discussions of people trying to reduce the complexity, is build tooling allows you to not have to think about it and yet still support browsers that you aren't even capable of testing, right? It's fine if you don't want to support IE8, let's say, but like, the reason your site doesn't work in IE8 shouldn't be a trailing comma. That is a completely ridiculous reason for your site to break. There's lots of great reasons for your site to break. Let it be one of those, right? And a build tool, and nobody's really worried about IE8 anymore, but like a build tool that strips trailing commas was a pretty easy, low-hanging fruit back at that time. And similarly now, like if you're just typing in arrow functions and you're shipping that to browsers, I mean, unless you need the very few parts of arrow functions that aren't syntactic sugar, there's no, like, that shouldn't be the reason your website breaks. Just transpile them. Like, just move on, transpile them, and like your site works for people.
Can I play devil's advocate?
Please.
Actually, Danny, do you want to go first?
No. I want to get into more of the tooling stuff specifically. Go ahead.
Oh, great. Phenomenal. So I want to play devil's advocate. So what if you could only use JavaScript in production that, well, not product. What if the JavaScript you write and the JavaScript you ship to production matched, in the sense that you had to wait until browsers implemented things, or you write your code in a way that's protective or whatever, like, but do we need to use the latest and greatest JavaScript, like in web applications that, to be quite frank, like, it's just you're making REST calls, you're fetching data, you're rendering stuff, like, most people are not doing anything super fancy, yet we feel the need to use stage 0 features in production. Like, I'm just,
I totally agree with that. Actually, I maintain over 250 NPM packages, and I use Babel on 2 of them. The rest of them I author in ES3. They work in IE6. Every single one of them. And that's, most of the time it takes no extra effort for me to do that. When it does, I may decide not to do it, but like, it's just easy. And yes, I don't get to use arrow functions and nice new syntax, but I don't have to deal with any tooling complexity either. Now, that said, that's not a trade-off that most people seem willing to make. Everyone really likes the new shiny, and they do not want to be forced to write what they see as outdated, obsolete legacy code, because of people who, who should just upgrade their browser, right? And so that's, for me, the tooling seems like a better compromise, where the developers aren't forced to keep in their brains all of the quirks of the older engines, but the users are not then punished.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That's actually, like, I think the best argument that I've heard for tooling. So thank you for that.
And to be really clear,
I also,
all of that should be easier, right? It should be easier to start. I'm not saying that the current learning curve is acceptable. Right. I'm only arguing for tooling.
Yeah, no. That makes sense, Jordan. Last joke that I want to say again. I'm like, I always have to make really corny jokes on this show because because anyways. But my corny joke is that web developers are a really self-select group of people, and they typically lean towards new bleeding edge. So I think it's a lot to ask web developers, people who live their life on the freaking edge of the world, to wait, so I think that's context to keep in mind for like the dilemma of today, but yeah, Danny, all you.
So this leans in really well to the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is about specific tools. So specifically, I want to talk about Babel. So transpilers have been around for a while. I had it on the tip of my tongue. Tracer was around before Babel, as like, I don't like that, not a ton of people use, but how, kind of marrying stuff we talked about at the beginning with specs and ease of use for developers that want to use shiny new things without impacting end users, how has Babel affected the standards process, or has it affected it at all? We were just saying, like, before there were there were no stages before. Now you can just go into Babel presets and be like, I want to use things that are at stage 0 or something like that if I want. So can you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, Babel has, I believe, deprecated the stage presets, thankfully, because I think Babel has massively affected it. I think part of the reason is because folks have been very wanton in their usage of like early proposals. I very strongly encourage everyone to never use anything in production until it's at least stage 3. Like, you can play with some things before that, but many things have changed drastically before then. But as far as your question, I mean, back when Tracer was commonly used, I don't even know if that's how you pronounce it, but that's how I've always read it. I actually was vehemently opposed to transpilers. That was my position for a long time. I did not like it. I didn't like looking at the output and seeing that it was gross. Even when source maps came, like it doesn't totally fix it. But I think that the ability for syntactic features to get feedback before they actually land in the browser and are never able to be removed, right? Because we can never break the web, right? The Space Jam website from '95 has to work forever. Like that is the mantra of the web, right? Do not break the web. So it's being able to get the sort of feedback on syntax before it's final is really critical. It's not as big a deal Babel only really transpiles syntax, right? The rest is, shims and polyfills, and you don't need Babel for that. It just can also sometimes do it. But shims and polyfills are part of the stage process as well. For some things, they can count as implementations, for stage 3. But I think that it would have been a real shame if we couldn't have had practice using class fields before it got to its current stage, which is 3. That informed a lot of the discussions. In some ways, it also helps persuade detractors, because a lot of people have intuitions about how confusing syntax is going to be or how easy it's going to be. And often those intuitions can be wrong in both directions. So for class fields, we had 5 years of tens of thousands of developers using it, putting it in documentation for public fields anyway, right? And understanding how it worked. And so when folks said, well, that's going to be unintuitive because it violates this expectation, we had a whole bunch of actual usage to show, no, it's not actually confusing. Maybe it confuses you, but it doesn't confuse most people, right? And that weighs into the discussion. And without that research, right, it's hard to know. And we never really know, right? All of these are guesses. We're all trying to make the best guesses possible for what's good for the language. And the more feedback and information we have, the better decisions we can make. And I think Babel helps with that. So and Babel implementers or maintainers are often in the TC39 meetings. So they're an active part of the process at this point, which I think is very important.
So I want to clarify one thing that you said before we move on, because I know we're also it feels like time is slipping away very quickly. So you said that polyfills can actually count as implementation in order to get to stage 4. Okay, yeah. So because when I thought you said implementation, I had assumed that meant, you need a browser implement or a JavaScript engine implementation to do it, but you're saying that is not the case.
This is the most contested part of the entire stage process. It's defined vaguely in the process document on purpose, because the group could not come to consensus and still can't about what it means. Essentially, I think the exact wording is 2 shipping implementations, such as a browser that's not behind a flag, right? But it really depends on what the proposal is. And I've tried suggesting things like defining risk areas and saying these risk areas need these kinds of implementations and so on. But it's really tough to get process changes in sometimes. But essentially for object.values and object.entries, nobody was concerned about implementing those. It was just kind of, it's going to be easy and fast to implement. So the polyfills for it that I published were able to count as one of the implementations. One browser and the polyfill covered it. But for async await, Babel's implementation doesn't count, right? In that regard, right? It helps inform the design, but it's not sufficient to say, yes, this can be implemented performantly. So I would say generally for syntactic features, it does require 2 unflagged web browsers, not in a nightly build or anything, but shipped to everyone.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, Jordan. So we've only got 5 minutes left. There's so much to talk about. We'll just have to have you back again to talk about some of the other things. What I'd love to dig into is just one specific feature that I think is ES 2020, the globalThis. So I think this is kind of a fascinating feature. I just was wondering if you could kind of give us an overview, what the context is. And I think for me, what's interesting is how I think the growth of JavaScript, in the browser, we're using more JavaScript, so now we need to take things off the main thread. So now we're using web workers and service workers, and we're caching things and in a strategic way. That has kind of led to this need to kind of have like realms, and I think these are things that I think the average web developer doesn't think about. And I would really love to just, if you can kind of walk us through globalThis. And
Sure.
I think it really hit the language a lot sooner than I thought it was. Like, I thought it was going to take a much longer. So I was surprised to see it go through that fast. Well,
yeah, I mean, this one is a bit of a saga. So there has not, before this, there wasn't any thing in the language that referenced the global, right? Like, which in browsers you could get it with, with window, and in Node you could get it with global, and in like web workers and frames and stuff you could get it with self, but there was never one consistent way. So you always had to do a bunch of feature checking to figure out which environment you were in order to get the global. So it seemed like a pretty simple idea that everyone was on board with. Let's just put a thing in the standard that can do this. And there was a bit of a churn trying to figure out some of those security concerns I had mentioned much earlier in the podcast. But once those had been kind of overcome, the main concern was the name of it. And unfortunately, the name global, which is the one everyone wanted and was the best, was not web compatible. It broke like Flickr or something because some old version of, I don't know, Moment.js, like, I don't know. It was just, there was some craziness that just broke major websites, and so we couldn't ship it. And so
Smooshgate.
Yes, I mean, it was
and
similar
you're
sort of
using
reason.
something like HTTP archive to do this analysis, right? And
Actually, in this case, I think Firefox shipped it and then got a bug report and unshipped it. I don't think they shipped it to, I think it was just in like their developer channel or something, but they very quickly got a report that it was broken.
Okay.
And so now at that point I had to figure out, how do I name this? What do I name it? And so I came up with, but I wanted to get, before I tried to ship it again, I wanted to get data as to figure out what was actually compatible. So I came up with a list of names by talking privately amongst the TC39 delegates. And some folks on the public GitHub repo had thrown some names into the hat as well. But the browsers didn't want to take my list of 20 names. They wanted like 4 or something. So I had to just arbitrarily choose which ones to gather data on. And then I got that data, and then I presented it, and we picked one of the names, and globalThis was the name that we went with. Like a few months after we decided on that, some famous authors got wind of it and sort of, not maliciously, but sicked their Twitter followers onto a GitHub thread. And so there was a lot of comments, and everyone was really angry with me and thought it was a terrible name. And they, the word "this" is confusing enough. Don't add it in more places, right? And they're all right? It's a terrible name, but it was the least terrible one that I was aware of. And so what I ended up doing was I met with another TC39 member who, she helped me come up with this naming document, which lists a bunch of constraints, like this is a must, this is a should, right? And all of these constraints suggest certain names and disqualify other names. And when you're done reading this document, it's kind of tough to be all ragey at me, because like, you understand hopefully why this was the option. So I'm really glad I wrote that document.
Yeah, that's super
worth reading.
Can we get
and
link
it's
to that in the show notes? I'm just curious. Is that something that's still up on
github.com/tc39/proposal-global, and then it's like naming.md in there.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, we'll have to link that.
Yeah, and that's an approach I want to take with controversial things in the future as well, for the same reason, because it seems to settle dissent. Sorry, go ahead, Danny.
No. I'm gonna say like that. I'm impressed that you remembered the URL off the top of your head.
Thank you.
This is Jordan Harband we're talking about here. He's like half human, half machine, 100% JavaScript human. Like,
well, Jordan, this has been an absolute delight. We're just about out of time now. If folks wanted to get in touch, if they have questions about TC39, if they wanted to get in touch with you on Twitter, what is the best way for folks to get in touch?
Yeah, I mean, my Twitter handle is LJHARB, and it's the same on GitHub and virtually everywhere else. You can email me, pick a site. You can find me on IRC in the, there's a bunch of channels on Freenode. I'm in the Node Slack, in the Babel Slack. Just kind of look for my handle anywhere and feel free to reach out. My DMs are open, so ask me anything.
Sorry, we couldn't talk for hours because we are live from OpenJS today, and we are under some time constraints. Nudge, nudge. So we're really, really grateful for your time, Jordan. This was really a blast. So
yeah, thanks. It's fun talking.
Yeah, and we'll just have to have you back.
Happy to be back. Let me know.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening in, and this has been the Web Platform Podcast.